So we have yet another major-ass quest to cover and synthesize, and this time it's even more important and even bigger than the other one. The problem this time around is that this quest has a fucking lot to talk about, and there's so many theories to cover that I just can't do what I did with the Dain quest. I'm taking a bit of a different approach this time. I'm going to use the quest as a starting point to talk about a few theories / discussion points, and then go from there. Most of these theories are coming from the discussion I had with the stream chat live, so if you want to go see my initial musings on the sudden blast of information I got that day, then you can see my full 4-hour stream VOD on the channel and click on the top right of the corner to go see that. Right, now that that's out of the way, let's get into the first part of this and a discussion that probably took way too fucking much time out of the stream. So something a lot of people brought up on the stream over and over and fucking over again is Dain's use of the term God. I thought nothing of it and just thought it was a matter of semantics, but once I got thinking about it, I actually started agreeing that there's a little bit more to it. So, when talking about beings who are more powerful than humans, there are multiple terms that someone can use to talk about them. These higher beings can be called gods, archons, divine, or, higher beings. I, and honestly probably every single Genshin lore tuber, has gotten slack for, quote, incorrectly using these terms. So in the world of Teyvat, let's define at least two of these terms. We're gonna assume that Teyvat is modeled after traditional Gnosticism. For those unaware, just watch this video by Island XD. He does a great job explaining the theory. However, for those that are too lazy to watch the video, I'll give you a quick rundown and give you a flowchart and visualize what we have going on here. In Gnostic religions, at the very top of the chart is just, God, aka the monad, the big boss. This is the being that created the universe and controls everything. However, this god is like lazy or something, and so creates beings that create this thing called the demiurge, which is immediately sealed away. The demiurge is unaware that the big guy above him exists, and so thinks that he is the big guy. We'll call this god the fake god. The fake god creates the world and humanity and accidentally gives humans the ability to rise to divinity. So here's the problem. The fake god needs to make it so that no random human can just ascend to divinity and pose a threat to literally everything he's created, and also probably himself. So that's where the Archons come in. They are the beings that are responsible for keeping humanity in check and making sure that the humans are to stay inferior in every way, shape, and form to anything divine. Okay, that's cool and all, but what's the point of this discussion of gods and Archons? Well, something that kept popping up was the discussion of Dain's use of the term God. Sometimes Dain uses the term God, and sometimes he uses the term Archon, and so chat got discussing what the difference was, if there even was one. When the discussion came up, I first pointed out that's probably a translation thing. But as May, our resident Mandarin speaker, pointed out in chat, the term Archon and God are differentiated just like they are in English. In the Chinese version, the word for God is, and excuse my pronunciation, Shen. And the term for the Archon is Mo Shen, or literally demon god. So at that point, I was sold on the fact that a god was different from an Archon, but the discussion of what the difference was continued. While continuing the quest, we got to thinking, during the Archon War, many gods fought for the right to be an Archon. So is an Archon a title? Can you be a god without being an Archon? We figured that the latter is true because Osial, the river god, the guy that we fight at the end of the Leeway chapter, is many times referred to as a god. Same with the Salt god. She never became an Archon, but she was still a god. And then there were times where beings like Andreas were called gods when previously we really didn't think of them as gods. Apparently the Four Winds were gods, but are not Archons. Then we had the discussion, are Adepti gods? At that point, once we differentiated the fact that Ganyu is not an Adepti and Xiao is, where Xiao is just an Adepti with a vision he wears for reasons beyond being his source of power, we came to this conclusion. The term God is an umbrella term used to describe any unique creature that has power beyond what humans can achieve by themselves, whether that be elemental or completely divine. Now, there are bound to be problems with defining such a cultural term. See these two videos, both by the same guy, and that both have really similar messages on why defining things is like the worst discourse. But in general, I think that this is a rather good definition that will serve my purposes for now. It will eventually get Socrates out of existence, but for now I think it allows us to define the things that we really need to define. Namely, an Archon is a god, albeit an extremely specific subset of God. Osial is god, just one that never became an Archon. Andreas is a god, and was actually next up for the Archon seat, but he refused. And an Adeptus is a god. While they do serve for the Geo-Archon, they are beings unique in nature that show powers that are beyond anything that humans can reasonably do. It can be argued that because they are created and are meant to serve a god above them, that they are not gods, but by that logic, literally every other higher being in the Genshin universe, except for the Monad, is not a god, and that's just getting so far into semantics to the point where it just becomes meaningless. I think that while this might seem pointless, I think there is actually a point of this discussion, and there's a few reasons why I think it's important. One, it's important to understand that the term God and Archon are not mutually exclusive. It's kind of like the whole squares and rectangles thing. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. By the same token, all Archons are gods, but not all gods are Archons. This gives us a further understanding of what role the Archons play. 2. It allows us to give a better distinction between every higher being in the world. Having an umbrella term to refer to every being that is above humanity in the game is going to come in super handy, and actually won't be as confusing as you might think it might be. You might think that everything falling under God means that only Archons have their own term, so both Andres and the god that created this world fall under the term God. But remember that the gods above the Archons have their own names to disambiguate, namely Demiurge and Monad. And 3, I am 90% sure that the game follows these same rules that we have set out. So when Dain or any other character refers to a god, we can assume they are referring to both the Archons or those below the Archons. And if they are referring to the Archons, well, we know what they're referring to. So now that that's out of the way, let's actually get into the more exciting stuff. So after this quest, we have learned like a lot of major shit about Dain. 1, we have come to understand to a greater degree where Dain stands in relation to everything. My initial assertion as to Dain's position stands correct. And 2, we have learned where Dain comes from. We had a hunch he was from Conria just because of Travail, but to what extent and why he hates the place so much and the people that comes from it was a little bit unclear. So these are pretty big lore dumps, and now we have new context for who Dain is and his possible motivations. So who is Dain? Well, let's let Lumion tell us.
That man, Dainslith, was the Twilight Sword, one of the royal guards of the final dynasty of Conria. 500 years ago, he failed to prevent the destruction of Conria. A curse of immortality was laid upon him to forever wander the wilderness, while he watched the people he was supposed to protect turn into monsters of the abyss.
So there are multiple things here. Dain was a knight of the Eclipse dynasty, the dynasty that controlled Conria up until the Cataclysm, and swore to protect Conria. Dain also had a very specific title on top of just being a part of the Knights. However, and what's strange about how Lumion tells us this information, it's implied that he single-handedly failed all of Conria and single-handedly let the Cataclysm take Conria. And while we don't know to what extent that is true, we can say that he was at least part of the reason why Conria fell. There were probably a lot of pieces, and while it is possible that he was the sole reason the nation fell, I think that something like this has a lot of moving pieces, so there's gotta be more to it. So no matter how much Dain fucked things up, he was still hit with the punishment of literal immortality, which seems harsh to me, but whatever. And that's the information we get left with. So what does any of this mean and what could it imply? Well, the first thing is that Dain is from Conria and was actually loyal to it before it fell. He swore to protect the dynasty by being a part of the royal guards of the Eclipse dynasty and even heralded his own title, the Twilight Sword. We also know that because of this, Dain watched Conria get smitten into smithereens by the gods. What's interesting about this is that it's most probable that Dain actually survived the Cataclysm, something that very, very, very few did. I think it's important to point out because it might actually give us an idea as to what Dain did to deserve his punishment of immortality. I think that because Dain survived the Cataclysm, something that if he was doing his job should have killed him, he ran away from his duties and his punishment was granted on account of his cowardice. In my head, this is what makes the most sense. It would be very unlikely that anybody who is supposed to defend a nation that is being attacked by the collective firepower of every divine being in Celestia is going to survive such an event. That's why it makes the most sense to me for Dain to get the fuck out of Dodge when things got sketchy. However, he doesn't realize that somebody actually notices the act of his cowardice. And they're like, nah, you watched our kingdom fall, now you're gonna watch literally everybody you know and love fall and burn to ashes. Now, this brings up a very interesting question. Who has the ability to make someone literally fucking immortal? Well, there are two powers in this world that we know of that are able to do something like make someone live forever. Someone who has the ability to control time, and somebody who is well-versed in an art that allows for the manipulation of life. The first one is something that could be likely due to a connection of power, but unlikely due to a lack of motive. Of course, I'm talking about the Archon of Time, or as I called it in my very first, very fucking outdated video on the topic, the Chrono Archon. I think that yes, it is possible, if such an Archon or God exists, that they could grant somebody immortality, either as a blessing or a curse. However, I don't think that a god or archon whose sole job at the time was to literally destroy a nation is going to punish somebody for not fighting back. I think that if a god were to do that, then it would be a god of Khaenri'ah itself, which, as we know from multiple times during the quest and from other sources, doesn't and has never existed. So who else might be able to make Dain immortal? Well, I think that there's a very high possibility that Khemia has the ability to make somebody immortal. Now, there's a theory that's been floating around ever since Albedo's quest about Reinidator and gold. And don't you fucking worry, I'll get the gold. The theory goes something along the lines of Reinidator is gold. The main logic behind this is the fact that lore in-game states that both Reinidator and gold corrupt the Dain, which is kind of strange. It's kind of contradictory. That leads people to think that because both people are very well versed in Khemia, an art that is shown to be able to manipulate life, and we don't know much about them, and because the game tells us that both of them did the same thing to Dain, then it's just easiest to say that they are the same person. Now, I'm not here to discuss the validity of that theory. However, if we do make the assumption that this is the case, that gold is Reinidator, then there is some ability within Khemia to make somebody live for a very, very long time, possibly forever. What makes this assumption stronger is a combination of two things. One, we don't know of any other power that might be able to do such a thing aside from something divine. And two, the gods wouldn't want to punish a person that didn't fight back anyways, so our only candidate at that point would be Khemia. And on top of all of this, Lumine says that Dain had to watch, quote,
the people he was supposed to protect turn into monsters of the abyss.
So this man is tortured and has gone through so much in the past 500 years. That makes him extremely knowledgeable of this world and makes his stance on everything extremely, extremely well developed. Dain just does not act out of fancy. He acts out of 500 years of deliberation. So what's Dain's stance and why does it contrast so heavily with Lumine and her goals? Well, Dain's position is somewhere in between what the Abyss stands for and what Celestia does. Dain has a similar goal to the Abyss, but despises what they are and how they go about their goals. And that goal is to overthrow Celestia. So he hates both the gods and the Abyss. And while hating the gods makes sense, why does he hate the Abyss so much? They're his people. Yes, perverted and twisted into creatures of the Abyss, but they're still his people nonetheless. So why? Well, there are two reasons that I can see for this being the case. And I actually think it would be most reasonable for it to be a mix of both of them. One, Dain sees the curse of immortality as betrayal. He thinks he did not do anything to deserve his punishment, because in his eye, he didn't do anything wrong. This thing that Dain did to deserve this curse is something we literally know nothing about, mostly because we learned it from a single line of dialogue and it never came up again for the rest of the quest. But from what I can tell and from what I can gather from Dain's character, whatever he did was probably something that we would have to hear his side of the story to judge whether or not it was his fault that Khaenri'ah fell and is something that deserves a curse of immortality. 2. It tortures him to see that those that he loved and the nation he fought for became perverted and twisted into a force that is evil and acts out of spite. I think part of the reason the Abyss is so adamant on overthrowing Celestia is because the Abyss knows the truth and knows what the goals of the Archons are, to make sure that humanity doesn't advance. I think Dain, watching his nation fall, and then those that survived become something twisted and his nation turned to a dredge of chaos and madness, turned him to despise them even more because that's not the home that he once knew. And because the Abyss goes about what they do with no regard for humanity, killing senselessly, Dain believes he can do the same thing the Abyss is trying to do, but in a better fashion. A little note about Dain being the reason Khaenri'ah fell. When the Abyss Herald talks to Dain directly, he talks about how he can sense his, quote,
soul is stained by terrible bloodshed, perhaps from your darkest nightmares.
I feel like this is referencing the fall of Khaenri'ah. Everybody blames Dain for what he did, so Dain might blame himself now for what he did after 500 years to ruminate on it. I don't know. The next line also implies that Dain uses the power of the Abyss, meaning he allows himself, at one point in his 500 years, to be corrupted by the Abyss. This line basically confirms that the, quote, power from beyond and the powers that he uses in the game is abyssal in nature, which is really strange to me. The power that he uses to choke the Abyss Herald really does not look like the trademark black and purple of the Abyss, and is instead much more blue and flame-like and has like a celestial nature to it. So maybe the power of the Abyss takes multiple forms, or maybe Dain's power is just something different. I don't know. Right, so this topic is something that is left pretty vague and is hard to understand, so I'm going to come right out of the gate and say that I am not the final authority on the subject, as is the case with literally every other subject I cover on this channel. What the timeline for the siblings look like is still very unclear, but I am going to give what I understand to be the timeline of the siblings based on the dialogue in this quest. So the timeline seems to be much more complicated from what we understood previously. From what we understood as a collective community, we knew that Aether and Lumine were separated through time, and at one point or another, they were 500 years apart. We assumed that the 500-year gap was from when the unknown god does her whole opening cutscene shebang, and separates the siblings, presumably knocking Lumine back down to Teyvat in that moment and sending Aether 500 years into the future. Cool. That was what we could gather from the opening information and the information seen in We Will Be Reunited, a trailer that only becomes more and more important as the time goes on. But this quest filled in some information we were missing that most everybody just kind of glossed over, even Paimon. What even happened to the siblings before they ran into the Sustainer? Well, the siblings' purpose in Teyvat is still something we don't quite fully understand. It is outside the scope of this video. But we can definitively say that they had a purpose in the first place, whether it be that they were just being the equivalent of galactic tourists, or were the two beings that, according to Gnosticism, were sent by the Monad to deal with the Archons doing shitty things. Either way, they came to Teyvat for a purpose. In the quest, we learned that there's actually a specific method to how the siblings travel through worlds. They kind of just shoot through these meteorites through the universes. It's kind of weird. And this is how the siblings crash into Teyvat. When the siblings arrive, the sibling in which you choose, so in the canonical case Aether, wakes up second, being woken up by Lumine. The time between when Lumine wakes up and Aether waking up is extremely unclear and is something I'll get into in a second. But whatever the timing is, Lumine wakes Aether up and basically says, "Bro, we need to get the hell out of here, and quick." Briefly, as they leave, Aether catches a glimpse of why Lumine said they should leave. Teyvat is absolutely fucked. Something happened that Lumine understands to a better degree than Aether that caused the world to end up in the state of chaos and destruction. This state, the thing that Aether sees before he departs with his sister, is what he dubs as the Sea of Fire. This Sea of Fire is what we see in We Will Be Reunited, the trailer. That disturbing image of a landscape of mountains flowing in the rivers of magma, ash particles surrounding you almost completely, and the sky tinted in a blood red color. This is what Teyvat looked 500 years ago. This is what the Wrath of the Gods look like. This is what Celestia is capable of. So they try to leave, as the siblings think that whatever the hell is going on is way above their pay grade. However, the Sustainer arrives to prevent their departure. And this is where we meet back up with our previous understanding of the world. From here, the theories that we came up with back before this quest still holds pretty strong. Aether is kind of put to sleep. He's not sent into the future, but he's kind of put into stasis for 500 years. And Lumine is sent back down to the Teyvat they were trying to leave behind. However, I'd like to bring something up that, while not something that disproves anything, brings into question about how we've interpreted something. We know that Lumine woke up before Aether, and she woke Aether up right before things started to get bad in Conria. But how long was she awake before she woke up Aether? There is a small chance that what we see in We Will Be Reunited is what Lumine saw before she woke Aether up. What Lumine sees in the trailer is what caused Lumine to wake Aether up and try and get out of Dodge as fast as they could. Now, I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm going to admit that it is a bit of a stretch. However, I'm bringing it up because it highlights the importance of knowing how long Lumine was awake for before she woke up Aether. The fact that there could have been a period of time of upwards of multiple years of where Aether was asleep and Lumine was just awake and kind of exploring the world makes things pretty different and opens up a lot of possibilities. However, if this period of time is something like when you wake up first at a sleepover and you're just waiting for your friend to wake up, but you get tired of waiting, so you just wake them up anyways, then the theories from before the quest as to the timeline of the siblings stays pretty much the same, as there is no substantial amount of time unaccounted for. The biggest thing that this brings up is that we don't nearly know enough, and in order for us to properly gauge where Lumine got her motives, and in order for us to fully understand how things went down 500 years ago, we need to know how long Lumine was awake and what she did in that unaccounted period of time. So with all this talk of Conria and the Cataclysm, what even happened to the city in the first place? Well, something really interesting did actually come up in this quest that, while seemingly contradictory to other information we know, might actually help us understand what happened to Conria way, way, way better. So before this quest, the story of the Cataclysm went something like this. Conria was a prosperous nation without a god, but at some point, an alchemist named Gold, who studied the local art of chemia, got too over their heads and did something that caused the cataclysm. Gold somehow released a power that wreaked havoc across the entirety of Teyvat and completely destroyed Conria altogether. However, with what we learned from this quest, we get a new perspective on what happened to Conria 500 years ago, and this new perspective contradicts literally every other account of what happened to the godless nation. So what new information did we get? Well, the information we got from Dain goes something like this. The entire job of the Archons is to make sure that humanity doesn't get too over their heads and get too powerful to where they're able to overthrow Celestia. This job came into use when the godless nation of Conria became too technologically advanced, developing things like field tillers, aka ruin guards. Because of these technological marvels, and supposedly the sign that they were up to something more nefarious, the gods gave Conria the ultimate bitch slap. They collectively descended onto Conria and destroyed everything there. This bitch slap was also apparently way too powerful and did more than just destroy Conria, and acted as more of a collective punishment to humanity. The destruction that Conria experienced was felt everywhere across Teyvat and acted as a way to force humanity to take 2 steps back after taking a solid step forward. So what's the case then? Was it gold or was it the Archons that fucked shit up? Well, I think it's both, but in historical records, the blame is pinned deliberately on gold. Think of it this way. The Archons are running a business. They keep their power when people worship this. We know this because Venti has little power because of the lack of worship. So in order for them to keep good optics and make sure the public doesn't absolutely despise them, they need to make history emphasize the things that make them look good and bury the things that make them look less so. While it's not true that gold causes the cataclysm, it's probably very likely that he was the reason the gods smote Conria into the first place. Think of gold in his work with Chemia like the nuke that Black Mesa set off in Half-Life Opposing Force, the thing that attracts the attention of the Combine and causes everything in Half-Life 2 to happen. In this case, Gold was doing things with their work that was just a little too high technology and a little too high profile, and in their work, something happened that caused the gods to notice what Gold was doing. The gods then decided to punish humanity as a whole for the atrocities that Gold accomplished. What Gold did that caused the gods to go sicko mode on humanity is unclear. However, it's probably safe to assume that it has something to do with what happened to Dain, as infecting a literal fucking dragon is pretty easy for the gods to notice. So after the gods do what is in their eyes necessary and a part of their jobs, they realize that what they just did is going to practically ruin humanity's perception of them. So in response to this, they basically rewrite history. They make sure that history only records part of the truth and not the whole truth. What they allow to be recorded is that Gold did something atrocious that caused the cataclysm and the fall of the Eclipse Dynasty. This information, as stated, is technically true, and it's designed to make the reader think that it was the bomb that caused the destruction of Teyvat, and not what the bomb attracted if we continue with the Half-Life analogy. It's very easy to assume that something as powerful as Chemia, from a nation as powerful as Conria, had the power to cause destruction at a scale never before seen by humanity. We, as the players, even thought this before we left this quest. We thought that it was Gold themselves that caused what we saw in We Will Be Reunited. And don't worry, I'm also getting there, don't worry. When in reality, that is the aftermath of the gods' rage against humanity. So the most important thing about this quest, I think, is that the historical records in this game are not entirely accurate and should not be taken as gospel. The history in this game is taken as real history. Things will be taken out of context, or exaggerated, or in some cases, entirely made up. And in other cases, things will be inaccurate or missing the whole of the story. And something like that is going to be all that more common because we have a higher power, in this case the Archons, most likely manipulating history and humanity's knowledge of what happened 500 years ago. This is something that rides off the paranoia that every Kaya stan shares. Kaya has very, very big dead in the later game energy. Something that this quest did that I don't think a lot of people noticed is the fact that this quest sets a tone. It sets a tone for very, very late game, but it does set a tone. In this case, this tone is seemingly very dark and reminiscent of Honkai's late game tone, a tone of destruction and violence by the gods. This is because we know that the Archons have one job, and part of that job, if it comes to it, is to literally rain fire upon those that push beyond the arbitrary boundaries set by them. They have the ability to create the equivalent to a Honkai in this world known as a cataclysm, and is something that is seemingly doomed to occur. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, MiHoYo has a track record of killing off characters in Honkai, especially when the story ramps up past Chapter 3. This is all stuff I've heard. I have never actually played Honkai past Chapter 3. So with this track record and the fact that the story of Genshin is projected to take a very dark turn here in later chapters, there is a very high chance that MiHoYo will kill off some Genshin characters. And the biggest candidate for this debate of who will die first has been Kaya. Now, you must be asking, what the fuck does this have to do with the new Archon quest? Well, esteemed viewer, with the information we gleaned about Conria in the new quest, it just makes Kaya really suspicious. Let me explain. Kaya's character story in the menu is one of the less revealing ones. From it, we learn that his full name is Kaya Alberich, that he was adopted into a Mondstadt family by Master Krepus, Diluc's father, that he's really smooth talking, and that his biological family is that of Conria heritage. Now, the fact that Kaya is from Conria isn't new, but what is new, however, is the fact that humans from Conria have started to turn into monsters of the Abyss due to something that happened after the gods destroyed Conria. This presents something that is a little strange. Kaya and his family are the only other people that we know of, aside from Dain, that have survived the Conria attack without becoming Abyss monsters. He is the only person that has ties to Conria that we know of that hasn't taken transformation into some horrible beast. So why hasn't he succumbed? There is a possibility that he is completely unaffiliated with the Abyss and he just embraces his heritage in his clothing and name because that's just who he is. But what's more interesting is the fact that Kaya is a very knowledgeable person and almost has too much knowledge of everything around him, even for somebody who's supposed to know what's going on most of the time. Now, this could very much be me putting on a tinfoil hat and going all conspiracy nut, but I think there's a very good chance that Kaya is not in fact completely separated from the Abyss, and I think that the Abyss could actually be one of his informants. There is absolutely no proof for this assertion. The only thing that I have that is even remotely supporting of this idea is that one moment from the Windbloom quest where he has Venti read his poem, which is literally a threat targeted towards Venti. Because Mimahuya is like something along the lines of, I will dominate over you or whatever in Hilichurl. The question this brings up is, why would Kaya want to threaten Venti? Or do something that would try and bait out Venti's knowledge of Hilichurl? We know that Venti knows Hilichurl just based off his reaction from when he first reads the poem. The only time Kaya would have a reason to do this in the first place is if he was suspicious of Venti in one way or another. And once you look through the Windbloom quest with that lens, it does seem really like Kaya has some sort of ulterior motive to doing Venti's class. Well, it's probably something along the lines of he has a feeling that Venti is a scam or something. There's also a chance that he's investigating Venti for something else, investigating his real identity perhaps. And if Kaya is trying to suss out Venti's real identity, where would he possibly get the information that Venti is really the Animal Archon in disguise? Well, there's a very high chance that the Abyss is aware of Venti's true identity, because the Abyss practically knows anything. Or maybe it's just the other way around. Kaya is acting as an informant for the Abyss, and he's acting on a tip the Abyss received that there is something up with that green bard that just showed up one day during the Storm Terror incident. Maybe the Abyss noticed this random bard that was just kind of there for no reason had way more power than he had any right to have. Or maybe they have a way of detecting divinity in disguise, and they caught hints of that divinity from Venti. Either way, I don't think it's too implausible, and either way, Kaya is extremely suspicious because of it. I swear, at this point, I watched this damn trailer so many times that I can recite it by memory. It's fucking ridiculous. Right, so while we haven't cracked the entirety of this trailer, we do have a bit better context now to very specific lines throughout the trailer. And I'd like to point out these lines and just kind of show that we really don't know a whole lot more. There's a lot to this trailer that we just need to let the chapters themselves decode their respective lines in travail. But that's not going to stop me from overanalyzing this shit anyways, so let's get into it again. First things first, the first line of the trailer. Spoken by Aether, he says that
we had no time to say goodbye, so let's not call it that.
While I think that my initial interpretation of this line holds true, I do want to point out that people have been thinking that this line has another context. It somehow ties back into the encounter between Lumine and Aether in the quest. The thinking goes something like this. In the quest, Lumine tells Aether that, quote, we have always had enough time, and then she goes on to say, goodbye, Aether. In that scene, Aether seemingly wanted to say so much more, and in my eyes, just wanted to hug his goddamn sister, Mihoya, please! That is the new thinking as to what this line means. And while it's very nice thinking, I think Occam's razor holds true here. It's just of a bit of a stretch that a single time that Lumine says goodbye, it means that this line immediately ties into that. I think that this line still means that there was no time to say goodbye when the Sustainer separated them. Also in the opening of this trailer, Dain says,
yet buried in the depths of this world lies smoldering remains, a warning to those that dare trespass.
So the reason I bring this up, and this is going to be a running theme throughout this section, is that we now have a very strong symbolic connection between two things, fire and the cataclysm, or the wrath of the gods. I make this connection because of what Aether calls the things he saw when him and his sister left Teyvat behind, the Sea of Fire. And the name is quite apt. In We Will Be Reunited, we see Lumine running through a Teyvat plunged into fire and magma. So when I hear Dain talking about how there are, quote, smoldering remains, that immediately makes me think of the Teyvat that had smoldered and the history that has been buried. Or, if you want to take it into a more literal sense, Conria is a nation that was underground, according to Albedo. It is very probable that if, say, something like the Pyro Archon led the charge against the nation, that there are quite literally smoldering remains buried beneath Teyvat that serve as a warning for those that dare trespass. However, with this context, the term of trespass holds a meaning that we don't really know of yet. Trespass here could mean trespass on Teyvat or in the ruins of Conria, but I no longer think that the trespass is referring to being unwanted within Celestia. I think it's more of a warning to those that dare trespass in Teyvat as a whole. Who they would want to target and who they would think would be trespassing in Teyvat in the first place, I don't know. Maybe people like the Travelers, but I feel like that's just a really weird, unlikely case for them to be warning people about. It's weird. Also, I still absolutely hate how the next line is in quotations, and we still don't fucking know who he is quoting or the you is. Right after that, Dain says,
None will escape the flames. See for yourself.
Which makes me think two things. One, when the gods want to fuck shit up, nobody is safe. And two, there are going to be more flames. If Dain introduces the quest that the Travelers are going to go on by saying, and this is literalizing what he's saying, assuming the flames is a metaphor for the gods going to town on Teyvat, see for yourself the fact that nobody is going to escape the wrath of the gods. Nobody is safe, which is foreshadowing if I've ever seen it. So skipping all the fucking way to the Natlan section, we get the line,
The rules of war are woven in the womb. The victors shall burn bright, while the losers must turn to ash.
Again, assuming that this vague reference of fire is in fact a metaphor for the wrath of the gods, this puts things into a different context. And the fact that these are the secrets that Murata is telling us, it just seems weirdly irrelevant to the destruction of Conria. In the case of Conria, the victors were the gods, where yes, they burned bright with victory, but the losers were Conria and its people, who were burnt to the ground and turned to ash. And if anybody has secrets to share to the Traveler about Conria, it's going to be the literal fucking Archon of War. And seemingly, if the Archon of War is on the side of the gods, then she's not going to share the secrets of war to the Traveler. And seemingly, if the Archon of War is on the side of the gods, then she's not going to share the secrets of war to the Traveler. But she has her reasons, so it's just a plot hook for the future. It looks like my interpretation of the ending of the trailer is spot on so far. Dain says that we are going to rescue her because he despises the Abyss and think that Lumin's position is that of one that needs saving. However, he still has similar goals to the gods. However, there are things here that still aren't quite proven and won't be until the very end of the game probably, when we're supposed to actually fight the fucker.
Then, the threads of all fate will be yours to reweave.
While we still don't know what this means, this reminds me a lot of Lumin saying that her, quote, war with destiny will be over. That's all there is to that connection. It's just empty. Okay, I have something that I just noticed. I'm writing a video concurrently with this one that's covering the entire timeline of Teyvat. And so in that research, I learned of these envoys of the gods, basically angels, but like there was a time where somebody just decided to try and stand against the gods before the Archon War, and their envoys by entering, quote, the Garden of the Heavens. When you think a Garden of the Heavens, what do you think of? A garden of massive proportions, a sprawling sea of plants fit for a god to take care of. Maybe something celestial in nature about it, starry in texture, looks like a sky. Now with this image in mind, what does it remind you of? Yeah, the sea of flowers and travail. That was just a thought. So, this quest has been a lot. I feel like there's so much more to talk about, but like, also not. Again, it's kind of like the first Dain quest where there's a lot of threads left out, but there's nothing to connect to those threads. So yeah, I'll get to it when there are connections to connect to. But as a sort of TLDR at the end of the of a 30+ minute video, I'll give a basic summary of everything we learned. Conria was a nation of technological development, and it was far and above the technology of anything else in Teyvat. Except something happened to the nation that made the gods take action and destroy the nation and force humanity as a whole to take a few steps back. In the Knights of the Eclipse Dynasty, the dynasty that controlled Conria at the time, had one member that went rogue and failed the nation, Dainslith. Due to this failure, Dain is punished with the Curse of Immortality. Aside from Dain, every other survivor of the cataclysm that the gods caused have started to become monsters of the Abyss. While all of this is happening, Lumin is just starting to wake Aether up and getting ready to leave. Once the two depart from Teyvat, they are stopped and knocked down back to Teyvat 500 years apart. And that's about what we learned from this quest. Now, time for a story drought all the way into Inazuma, y'all. So I'll see y'all then.